Hi poetry lovers, welcome to my channel Bella Poetry Presents. I am Bella and I introduce on my channel different stories, wonderful stories of the world-renowned poets and their beautiful poetry. We have 4 series, please check them out. And in our last series, which is called Poetry at Random, I talk about various poets, female and male. So far I discuss more modern poets, mainly female poets that write in free verse, but I mentioned last time when we talked about the Greek poet Kiki Dimula that although I truly appreciate the literary merit of these poetesses, I myself am a romantic poet and I love romantic poetry. So that brings me back to the romantic poetry, to William Wordsworth. But before we talk about the poet in this segment, I want to talk about what Romanticism is. Romanticism in poetry is a literary movement that began in the late 18th century, and this movement emphasizes emotion, imagination, nature, and individual experience over rules, logic, and formality. In simple terms, romantic poets believe that feelings and creativity are more important than strict structure or reason. The key features of romantic poetry are strong emotions like love, joy, sorrow, nature that was seen by them as beautiful and powerful, imagination and creativity, the poet's inner world matters, individualism, which focuses on personal thoughts and unique experiences, freedom of expression, which shows less concern for rigid poetic rules, and the ordinary and the mystical, everyday life mixed with mystery. And the common themes of that romantic poets share are love and longing, childhood and innocence, the beauty and power of nature, freedom and rebellion, and the supernatural or mysterious. So today, as I mentioned before, we will discuss the life and the poetry of William Wordsworth. So I will, as I start every segment, I show you the portrait of a poet that I'm talking about. This is the portrait of William Wordsworth. So William Wordsworth was born on April 7, 1770 in Cockersmouth, Cumberland, England. And he was an English poet whose lyrical ballads published in 1798, written together with Samuel Taylor Coleridge, helped launch the English Romantic movement. By seeking to compose poetry that reflects incidents and situations from common life, and to relate or describe them throughout as far as was possible in a selection of language really used by man, Wordsworth with Coleridge essentially changed English language literature. Wordsworth was born in the Lake District of northern England, the second of 5 children of a modestly prosperous estate manager. His father, John Wordsworth, was also the personal lawyer of Sir James Lowther, Earl of Lonsdale. His mother, Anne, was the daughter of a cloth merchant and a member of the noble Krakenthorpe family. Wordsworth lost his mother when he was only 7 years old, and then 6 years later he lost his father. When he was 13, his father passed away, upon which he and his brothers, Richard, John, and Christopher, were sent off by guardian uncles to a grammar school at Hawkshead, a village in the heart of the Lake District. Now, he also had a sister, the only sister, Dorothy, and she was sent to live with relatives in Halifax. At Hawks's, Wordsworth received an excellent education in classic literature and mathematics. But the chief advantage to him there was the chance to indulge in the boyhood pleasures of living and playing outdoors that later showed itself in his love and admiration of nature. The natural scenery of the English lakes could terribly affect as well as nurture. So they could terrify and at the same time nurture the person who lived there. As Wordsworth would later testify in the lines he wrote, "I grew up fostered alike by beauty and by fear." Now, in 1987, Wordsworth moved to St. John's College in Cambridge. But he was kind of repelled by the pressures and competitiveness of the school, and he elected to kind of idle his way through university, convinced that he was not for that hour, as he wrote, not for that place. The most important thing he did in his college years was to devote his summer vacation in 1790 to a long walking tour through revolutionary France. There he was caught up in the passionate enthusiasm that followed the fall of the Bastille, and he became the ardent Republican sympathizer. Upon taking his Cambridge degree, an undistinguished past, as he called it, he returned in 1791 to France. In France, he fell in love with a French woman whose name was Annette Vallon, but she got pregnant, but after he left for England, and their child Caroline, his daughter, was born in December 1792. But Wordsworth was already in England when that happened, and he didn't see his daughter until she was 9, due to the war that broke out between England and France. The 3 or 4 years that followed his return to England were the darkest of Wordsworth's life. He was unprepared for any profession. He was ruthless. He had no money. He was bitterly hostile to his own country's opposition to the French. He lived in London in the company of radicals such as William Godwin, and learned to feel a profound sympathy for the abandoned mothers, beggars, children, and victims of England's wars, who began to march through the somber poems he was writing at this time. Now, this very dark period ended in 1795, when a Friend's legacy made possible Wordsworth's reunion with his beloved sister Dorothy. Together they moved to Alfoxden House near Bristol in 1797. William and Dorothy Wordsworth were never again to live apart. Indeed, with the exception of Coleridge, no one had a greater influence on Wordsworth and his development as a poet than his sister. And I think that the intensity of siblings' bond stemmed from having been orphaned at such an early age. And they kind of shared a creative sensibility. They both were very talented. Dorothy was also a writer, although a very private one compared with her brother, who enjoyed public fame. She kept journals in which she recorded household events as well as her observations of the local landscapes that she and her brother frequently explored on their long walks. Now, some critics, as there are always conversations about people, and people make assumptions that are not that are often not true, they said that maybe Wordsworth were too influenced by Dorothy, and they even talked about plagiarism, as if he borrowed her expressions from her diaries and nature descriptions. But I think they simply talked a lot, and their views and their impressions kind of, how I would say, affected each other's writings. Stimulated by Coleridge and under the healing influence of nature and his sister, Wordsworth began in 1797-98 to compose the short lyrical and dramatic poems for which he is best remembered by many readers. Many of these short poems were written to a daringly original program formulated jointly by Wordsworth and Coleridge, in which, as we said before, they aimed at breaking the decorum of neoclassic verse. They wanted to use the language that people used for conversations. These poems appeared in 1798 in a slim, anonymously authored volume titled Lyrical Ballads. The second consequence of Wordsworth's participation with Coleridge was the framing of a vastly ambitious poetic design that teased and haunted him for the rest of his life. Coleridge had projected an enormous poem to be called The Brook, in which he proposed to treat all science, philosophy, and religion. But he soon decided not to continue with that, and he laid the burden of writing this poem upon Wordsworth himself. And as early as 1798, Wordsworth began to talk in grand terms of his poem, and he decided to call it The Recluse. To nerve himself up to this enterprise and to test his powers, Wordsworth began writing an biographical poem that would absorb him intermittently for the next 40 years, and which was eventually published in 1850 as The Prelude, or another name, Growth of a Poet's Mind. This is a very, very famous work by Wordsworth. The Prelude extends the quiet autobiographical mode of reminiscence from his school days through his university life and his visits to France up to the year 1799, in which he settled in Grasmere. Now, I visited Grasmere when I was in England quite a few years ago, and it's a beautiful, beautiful village. Wordsworth actually is buried there, and he wrote many beautiful poems there, and the nature is just so gorgeous and so inspirational. I sat there by the brook drinking tea and eating gingerbread cookies, and this experience will always stay with me. About this time, Wordsworth also wrote the brilliant lyrics that were assembled in his second verse collection, Poems in 2 volumes, published in 1807, including the enduringly popular I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud, also known as Daffodils. Grasmere has beautiful fields of daffodils. All of these poems make up what is now recognized as Wordsworth's great decade, stretching from his meeting with Coleridge in 1797 until 1808. Now, altogether, William Wordsworth wrote 387 poems during his lifetime. This total does not include poems he wrote as a young man prior to the publication of his first poem in 1787. In 1802, during the short-lived Treaty of Amiens, a peace agreement during the Napoleonic Wars, Wordsworth returned briefly to France, where at Calais he met his daughter Caroline and made his peace with Annette Vallon. He then returned to England and he married Mary Hutchinson, a childhood friend, and he started an English family. And by 1810, he had 5 children, 3 sons and 2 daughters. The names of the children were John, Thomas, William, and the daughters were Dora and Catherine. But in 1805, a terrible thing happened. His favorite brother, John, drowned. He was the captain of a sailing vessel. And because of his death, Wordsworth experienced the strongest shock ever. In the middle period, Wordsworth invested a good deal of his creative energy in odes, the best known of which is On the Power of Sound. He also produced a large number of sonnets, most of them strung together in sequences. But the most memorable poems of Wordsworth's middle and late years were often cast in a very sad mood. They range from the poet's heartfelt laments for two of his children who died in 1812, laments incorporated in the Excursion, to brilliant lyrical effusions on the death of his fellow poets James Hogg, George Crabbe, Coleridge, and Charles Lamb. Let's talk about the late work of William Wordsworth. In 1808, Wordsworth and his family moved from Dove Cottage to large quarters in Grasmere, as we said, and 5 years later they settled at Riddall Mount near Ambleside, where Wordsworth spent the remainder of his life. William Wordsworth died on April 23rd, 1850, at the age of 80, from pleurisy. His final days were marked by his work on his semi-autobiographical poem, The Prelude, which we talked about, which his wife published after his death the same year. His reported last words were, "Is that Dora?" in reference to his deceased daughter. And Wordsworth passed away at his home in England's Lake District, and he is buried in the churchyard of St. Oswald's in Grasmere, a place deeply associated with his life and poetry. And now we will read a couple of his poems. The first one is called It's a Beauteous, interesting word, a beauteous evening, calm and free. It's a beauteous evening, calm and free. The holy time is quiet as a nun. Breathless with adoration, the broad sun is sinking down in its tranquility. The gentleness of heaven broods over the sea. Listen, the mighty being is awake, and doth with his eternal motion make a sound like thunder everlastingly. Dear child, dear girl, that walkest with me here, if thou appear untouched by solemn thought, thy nature is not therefore less divine. Thou liest in Abraham's bosom all the year, and worshippers at the temple's inner shrine, God being with thee when we know it's not. The second poem that I will read to you is his very famous poem called I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud. I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high over vales and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils, beside the lake, beneath the trees, fluttering and dancing in the breeze, continuous as the stars that shine and twinkle on the Milky Way. They stretched in never-ending line along the margin of a bay. 10,000 saw at a glance, tossing their heads in sprightly dance. The waves beside them dance, but they outdid the sparkling waves in glee. A poet could not but be gay in such a jocund company. I gazed and gazed, but little thought what wealth the show to me had brought. For oft When on my couch I lie, in vacant or in pensive mood, they flash upon that inward eye, which is the bliss of solitude. And then my heart with pleasure fills, and dances with the daffodils. So such a beautiful, I love this poem. It's one of his most famous poems. I think the simplest poems are the most beautiful, truly, in my opinion. Well, here we came to the end of this segment. It's Bella again. Please don't forget, if you like the segment, to like and subscribe. Many more segments to come. Thank you very much for listening, and have a wonderful, wonderful day. Bye-bye.